how does a guy who literally swept floors at a JCPenney for 17 years end up dying with an $8 million fortune while a Harvard-educated Merrill Lynch executive goes completely bankrupt?
It's pretty wild to think about.
Right. Welcome to today's deep dive. Because if you're listening to this right now, you interact with money every single day.
Well, we all do.
We all do. But the stack of notes and research we're unpacking today proposes this deeply counterintuitive idea. Basically, doing well with money has almost nothing to do with how smart you are and absolutely everything to do with how you behave.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate equalizer, isn't it? Because when we talk about elite performance or like the absolute pinnacle of success in almost any other field, there's this incredibly strict expectation of pedigree.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about engineering. You do not just, stumble your way into building a structurally sound suspension bridge.
No, definitely not.
It requires years of rigorous study, a mastery of physics, and a really specific set of verifiable credentials.
Exactly. Or look at medicine. If you're going in for a heart transplant, that environment is clean, it's objective, and it's entirely reliant on formal education.
Yeah. The surgeon has been trained for over a decade.
Right. They don't just guess where the arteries go based on their gut feeling or what they had for breakfast.
And I think it's deeply comforting for us, just as a society, to believe that the most important systems in our world operate that way.
For sure.
We desperately want things to be categorized, to be logical. We want them to be driven by undeniable expertise. We want the smartest person in the room to, automatically be the most successful person in the room.
But then, and this is the crazy part, you step into the world of personal finance. You step into the psychology of money, and suddenly that entire logical framework just completely collapses.
It really does.
We're looking at a landscape that is honestly completely upside down compared to everything else we know about success. And it's why we consider this topic to be, honestly, one of the greatest shows on earth. Because money acts as this massive, unavoidable magnifying glass for human behavior, for our relationship with risk, and maybe most importantly, for our own deeply buried insecurities.
Which brings us right to the central paradox we're exploring today. The materials we're referencing were born out of a massive realization following the 2008 financial crash.
Oh, man, 2008.
Right. The core revelation was that finance is not driven by physics or complex mathematics or hard, immutable rules. It's driven by the messy, unpredictable realities of human behavior.
Yeah.
And to truly understand how that works, we have to look at the extremes. We've got three incredibly vivid, real-world stories in front of us that absolutely shatter the illusion of financial intelligence.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to start with the first story, which centers on a highly successful technology executive in Los Angeles.
Oh, this guy.
Yeah, this guy. Now, on paper, if you look at his resume, he is the very definition of a genius. In his 20s, he designed and patented a key component that is literally used in Wi-Fi routers globally.
So he's brilliant.
Technically brilliant, he started multiple tech companies, sold them, and became wildly, incomprehensibly successful. By all traditional metrics, he is a genius.
But his relationship with his actual wealth was entirely disconnected from that raw intelligence.
Yeah, disconnected is an understatement.
If you look at the accounts of his behavior, it's this fascinating, almost tragic mix of deep-seated insecurity and reckless impulsivity.
And honestly, calling it impulsive is almost letting him off the hook. I mean, picture this guy. He constantly carries around a physical stack of $100 bills.
Literally several inches thick.
Right. A brick of cash. He's pulling it out at high-end hotels, showing it to anyone who will look, bragging loudly about his net worth, often while heavily intoxicated and just, completely unprompted.
It's all ego.
Pure ego.
Okay.
But there's a specific anecdote in our notes that just blew my mind. He's hanging out at a luxury hotel, and he hands a colleague a few $1,000s in cash. And he tells the guy, go to the jewelry store down the street and get me a few $1,000 gold coins.
Now, if you're analyzing this purely from a traditional finance perspective, you might think, okay, an eccentric but maybe somewhat logical investment.
Sure, maybe.
Like storing wealth in tangible precious metals as a hedge against inflation.
Right. You're trying to find the logic. But there is no logic. Because an hour later, this tech genius and his buddies are standing on a dock overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
Oh.
They take these solid gold $1,000 coins and they start skipping them into the sea like flat rocks.
Like they're at a pond.
Yes. Just violently chucking them into the dark water, cackling, arguing about whose gold coins skip the furthest. just for fun.
It's a breathtaking display of financial nihilism.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the psychology required to do that.
I can't even wrap my head around it.
Why do we skip rocks as kids? We do it to see a physical, immediate effect on our environment. Doing it with heavy gold coins is a way of trying to force the world to acknowledge your power.
Wow. Yeah.
He is literally throwing his stored labor, his wealth, into the abyss for a fleeting 3-second moment of ego validation.
And his desperate need for that ego validation only gets worse. A few days after the gold coin incident, this same executive is in the hotel's restaurant and he shatters an expensive lamp.
Classic.
The manager comes over, very professionally, and informs him that it was a $500 lamp and it's going to need to be replaced. And the executive reacts with pure, unadulterated outrage.
He felt insulted.
So insulted. He pulls out his massive brick of cash, peels off $5,000, shoves it into the manager's chest and says, "Here's $5,000, now get out of my face, and don't ever insult me like that again."
Look at the exact phrasing there. Don't ever insult me. He felt insulated by his money, but also incredibly fragile. He believed that paying 10 times the actual cost of the physical damage effectively purchased him the right to demean another human being.
It's so gross.
He possesses immense technical intelligence. He holds patents that make modern internet communication possible, but he has absolute zero emotional intelligence regarding his resources. And the punchline to this story is entirely predictable to anyone who studies human nature.
He went completely broke.
Yeah.
He went broke. A certified tech genius, a millionaire, loses every single dime. Now, if you're listening, I want you to keep that chaotic implosion in your mind because we're going to contrast it with our second story. The absolute polar opposite of the tech executive, a man named Ronald Read.
Ronald Read's life is quietly extraordinary.
It's so quiet.
He lived a life of such extreme routine and modesty that he was essentially invisible to the world around him.
Completely invisible. He was born in rural Vermont. He was the very first person in his entire family to graduate from high school, and he had to hitchhike to campus every single day just to get that basic education.
Wow.
Yeah. And after that, there wasn't a whole lot of glamour to his resume. For 25 years, he fixed cars at a local gas station. For another 17 years after that, he swept floors at a JCPenney.
Think about the physical and psychological reality of that for a second. 17 years pushing a broom in a retail store.
Right. And at age 38, he bought a tiny 2-bedroom house for $12,000, and he lived in that exact same house for the rest of his life. He was widowed at 50, never remarried, and his primary hobby, the thing he did for absolute joy, was chopping firewood.
A life of manual labor, thrift, and extreme quiet. There are no gold coins being hurled into the Pacific Ocean here.
None.
There are no $5,000 ego trips at a restaurant.
None of it. But here is the massive twist in the narrative. Ronald Read died in 2014 at the age of 92. And suddenly, this humble rural janitor is making international headlines.
Because of his net worth.
Exactly. Because in 2014, out of the roughly 2.8 million Americans who passed away that year, fewer than 4,000 of them died with a net worth over $8 million. And Ronald Read was one of those 4,000.
A gas station attendant and part-time janitor who chopped his own firewood died with an $8 million fortune.
It sounds fake.
It almost sounds like a fabricated fable.
Everyone who knew him was completely baffled. His friends and neighbors wondered if he had, won the lottery in secret decades ago or if there was some massive hidden inheritance he never spoke about.
But there was no secret windfall.
No! He simply saved whatever tiny microscopic amount he could from his incredibly modest paychecks, and he invested it in blue-chip stocks. And this is the hardest part for most human beings, he just waited.
And just to clarify for anyone listening who might not be deep into the jargon, when we say blue-chip stocks, we're talking about massive, stable, historically reliable companies, household names.
Right.
He wasn't gambling his floor-sweeping money on volatile penny stocks or risky tech startups. He was buying tiny pieces of the most boring, reliable companies on Earth.
Yeah, he was buying the financial equivalent of chopping firewood. Steady, boring, reliable. He let those tiny, consistent savings compound over decades until they swelled into more than $8 million.
He didn't just hoard it either.
No. Upon his death, he left $2 million to his stepkids and more than $6 million to his local hospital and library, from a JCPenney janitor to a multi-millionaire philanthropist.
And to fully appreciate the sheer magnitude of Ronald Read's achievement, we have to look at the third figure in our research today. He serves as the ultimate foil to Ronald Read, a man named Richard Fuscone.
Yes, Richard is the perfect contrast. Because Richard Fuscone had every single systemic advantage, every credential, and every opportunity that Ronald Read completely lacked.
Exact opposite.
Right. Richard was Harvard educated. He got his MBA from an elite institution. He became a top executive at Merrill Lynch. He was so incredibly successful in the high-stakes, cut-throat world of global finance that he literally made Crane's Business Magazine's 40 under 40 list.
And he actually retired in his 40s to become a philanthropist.
Yeah. The former CEO of Merrill Lynch publicly praised his business savvy, his leadership, and his supposedly impeccable judgment.
He is the absolute embodiment of traditional credentialed financial intelligence. If you were going to design the perfect financial mind in a lab, you would build Richard Fuscone. He represents the peak of the mountain.
But then we look at the reality of his behavior. In the mid-2000s, Richard borrowed heavily. He took on massive, crippling debt to expand an 18,000-square-foot mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut.
That is massive.
And we need to pause and visualize this excess because it speaks directly to his psychology. This house had 11 bathrooms. 11. It had 2 separate elevators, 2 pools, 7 garages. It cost more than $90,000 a month just in basic maintenance.
90 grand a month just to keep the lights on and the grass cut.
Right. Guests who went to his parties recalled the absolute thrill of dining and dancing on a custom see-through floor positioned directly over the indoor swimming pool.
It is the architectural equivalent of skipping gold coins into the ocean. It's a monument to ego, entirely funded by leverage. He didn't just want a nice house. He needed a fortress that visually communicated his superiority to everyone who walked through the doors.
Exactly. And then the 2008 financial crisis hits. And while that massive economic earthquake hurt almost everyone, it completely vaporized Richard Fuscone.
Because of the debt.
High debt and totally illiquid assets left him backed into a corner. In 2008, he stood before a bankruptcy judge and stated on the record, "I currently have no income."
Wow.
First, his secondary home in Palm Beach was foreclosed on. And then, in 2014, the exact same year that Ronald Read, the janitor, died and left $6 million to charity. Richard Fuscone's 18,000-square-foot Greenwich mansion was sold in a foreclosure auction for 75% less than an insurance company had valued it at.
So we have Ronald Read, the endlessly patient janitor, and Richard Fuscone, the greedy, over-leveraged Harvard executive.
Yeah.
And as our research points out, the fascinating thing here isn't just a moralistic tale that we should try to be more like Ronald and less like Richard. What's truly profound, and what we need to unpack, is how entirely unique this scenario is to the specific field of finance.
Right. Think about the anomaly this represents. In what other field on planet Earth does someone with 0 formal education, 0 professional training, 0 background, and absolutely 0 industry connections massively and demonstrably outperform someone with the absolute best education, the best training, and the most elite connections in the world?
It simply does not happen. You cannot have a janitor outperform a Harvard-trained heart surgeon in an operating room.
Never.
The janitor doesn't possess the technical knowledge of the vascular system. You will never see a gas station attendant design a skyscraper that is structurally superior to the work of a master architect. You will never see an amateur consistently outperform the world's top nuclear engineers. The hard sciences simply do not allow for it. The barriers to entry are based on hard, verifiable facts.
But in finance, Ronald Read and Richard Fuscone coexist. Because, as our notes argue, finance isn't a hard science. Ronald Read was patient, and Richard Fuscone was greedy. That behavioral difference was so incredibly powerful that it completely eclipsed the massive, gaping chasm in their education and experience.
All behavior.
But, okay, I have to push back on this premise just a little bit. Wait, is it entirely just patience and greed? Isn't there at least some baseline level of math required to know what a blue chip stock even is? I mean, Ronald Read had to know enough to put his money into the market, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Because if I look at the tech executive skipping the gold coins, I don't just see a lack of patience. I see a very specific psychological analogy playing out. It's like watching someone play a video game with the infinite money cheat codes turned on.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. When you have unlimited resources in a game, you stop playing the actual game. You just blow things up, you act chaotic because there are no consequences. You don't build a city, you just spawn 100 tanks and crash the server. Is finance really just entirely about behavior, or is there a minimum threshold of knowledge required to even be in the game?
I love that video game analogy,
I
and we
see.
should definitely explore that. Because when you turn on the infinite money cheat code, the game loses its meaning. The tech executive lost the meaning of money. It ceased to be a tool for security and became a toy for destruction.
Exactly.
But to address your pushback, yes, Ronald Read possessed a rudimentary understanding. He knew what a stock was. He understood the basic mechanism of a dividend. But the core argument we're looking at is that this baseline knowledge is incredibly simple. It's not calculus. It's basic arithmetic.
Okay.
The dividing line between massive success and total ruin isn't the complexity of the math. It's the mastery of the mind. The tech executive and Richard Fuscone possessed infinitely more financial knowledge than Ronald Read. But their behavioral flaws, their arrogance, their ego, their desperate need for social validation through excess acted as a massive negative multiplier that absolutely destroyed their technical advantage.
So if financial success is genuinely about behavior, if a patient janitor reliably beats a greedy genius, then why is the entire financial industry built on the premise of incredibly complex math? This feels like a massive disconnect.
And that disconnect is precisely the systemic failure of how financial education is structured globally. The research points out that finance is overwhelmingly taught as a math-based discipline.
Which makes sense on the surface, I guess.
Right. The prevailing paradigm in every business school is this. You put data into a complex formula. The formula tells you the mathematically optimal thing to do, and the underlying assumption is that human beings will simply act like rational robots and execute the formula perfectly.
Which is how we get all these rigid robotic rules. Personal finance gurus stand on stages and tell you, save exactly 10% of your income and maintain a 6-month emergency fund.
Yep.
In professional investing, they rely on these incredibly exact historical correlations between interest rates and market valuations. In corporate finance, CFOs are measuring their exact cost of capital down to the third decimal point.
And to be entirely fair, the math itself isn't wrong. A spreadsheet calculating compound interest is factually correct.
You can't argue with the spreadsheet.
Exactly. The problem, the massive gaping hole in this logic, is that knowing what to do tells you absolutely nothing about what actually happens in your head when you try to do it under pressure.
Yes. Our notes make this brilliant, illuminating comparison between the health industry and the wealth industry. Think about modern healthcare. It is an undeniable, objective triumph of modern science.
Without a doubt.
We have rising life expectancies across the globe. Scientific discoveries have fundamentally replaced old, ignorant ideas about how the human body works, and as a result, virtually everyone on Earth is healthier. The science was applied, and the science worked.
But the money industry, investing, personal finance, economic planning, tells a completely different story. Over the last 2 decades, the finance sector has scooped up the smartest mathematical minds for the top universities in the world.
Right.
Our research notes that about a decade ago, financial engineering was actually the most popular major in Princeton School of Engineering.
Princeton. They are taking the absolute brightest minds of a generation, the people who possess the intellect to cure diseases or build sustainable fusion reactors, and they're putting them to work building financial algorithms to shave fractions of a cent off high-frequency trades.
It's wild.
But the incredibly devastating question we have to ask is there any evidence that all this elite brain power has actually made us better investors?
And the conclusion is a resounding no. There is no compelling evidence whatsoever.
None.
None. Through trial and error over centuries, humanity learned how to be vastly better farmers, better chemists, better structural engineers. But has trial and error made the average person fundamentally better with their personal finances?
Probably not.
Are we as a society suddenly less likely to bury ourselves in crippling credit card debt? Are we more likely to save for a rainy day? Do we have more realistic, grounded views about what money can and cannot do for our internal happiness? The data heavily suggests we haven't improved at all.
This was a specific catalyst for the author of our source material. They noted that they began writing about finance in early 2008, right at the dawn of the worst global recession in 80 years.
Very chaotic time to be writing about money.
Totally. And as they were trying to write about the crisis, trying to figure out what was actually happening beneath the surface, they realized something terrifying. No one could accurately explain why the entire global financial system was collapsing. For every brilliant Nobel-winning economist who had a perfectly modeled explanation, there was an equally brilliant economist with an equally convincing mathematical rebuttal.
Because they were trying to explain a psychological behavioral crisis using the rigid language of physics. The distinction here is profound. Engineers can flawlessly determine the exact structural cause of a bridge collapse.
Because the math is universal.
Yes. because physics isn't controversial. There is universal agreement that if a specific amount of force is applied to a specific load-bearing area of a bridge, the steel will snap. It is guided by immutable, unquestionable laws.
But finance is not guided by laws of nature. It's guided by the erratic, emotional, deeply irrational behaviors of human beings. And what makes perfect sense to me in a moment of sheer panic might look absolutely crazy to you sitting calmly at your desk.
Yes.
You cannot put a mathematical formula on the feeling of panic. Which brings up this incredible quote from the philosopher Voltaire that is included in our notes. History never repeats itself. Man always does.
Such a powerful quote.
So, what does this all mean for you and me? I keep thinking about this, like trying to stick to a strict diet. Knowing the exact nutritional macros of a meal plan, knowing that a piece of chicken has this much protein and this much fat, that's the math. It's objective, it's right there on the spreadsheet. But staring at a giant, decadent piece of chocolate cake after you've just had a terrible, stressful, soul-crushing day at work, that's the psychology.
Yep.
The spreadsheet doesn't know you had a bad day. The spreadsheet doesn't know your boss yelled at you. But I have to ask you, if the smartest financial engineers from Princeton couldn't fix this system with advanced mathematics, is the financial system just inherently unfixable? Because human nature is unfixable.
Let's expand on your diet analogy, because it perfectly captures the dilemma. The spreadsheet gives you the what, but the chocolate cake offers immediate emotional comfort, the why.
Right, the why is so strong.
When you're stressed, your brain isn't craving calories, it's craving relief. I wouldn't say the financial system is unfixable, but our entire approach to it is fundamentally flawed. We keep trying to solve a deeply psychological problem with a mathematical tool.
Okay, that makes sense.
To grasp why people willingly bury themselves in high-interest debt, you don't need to study interest rate yields. You need to study the history of human greed, deep-seated insecurity, and our desperate primal desire for social status.
Wow, yeah.
To understand why an otherwise rational investor panic sells all their retirement stocks at the exact bottom of a bear market, studying the math of expected future returns is completely useless. You have to understand the sheer emotional agony of a parent looking across the dinner table at their family and genuinely wondering if their investment choices are about to ruin their children's future.
And that deeply personal, deeply emotional experience brings us to the very core thesis of our deep dive today. It's a concept that is framed as the 0.000000001% rule.
It's quite a fraction.
It is. We've established that our behavior dictates our financial success. But what actually dictates our behavior? We need to transition from these massive societal failures to the deeply personal roots of our decision-making.
And this is where we encounter the central, beautiful, and somewhat terrifying paradox of this material. The premise states very plainly, people do crazy things with money, but no one is crazy.
Let that sink in for a second. If you're listening, just think about that. People do crazy things, but no one is crazy. Why? Because, as our research explains, your personal lived experiences with money make up maybe 0.000000001% of what has actually happened in the economic history of the world.
A tiny fraction.
Tiny. But those tiny, limited, highly specific experiences dictate 80% of how you think the entire world works.
We are all essentially trapped in the invisible bubble of our own lived experience. Think about the massive spectrum of experience that exists. Consider the worldview of someone who grew up in crushing generational poverty versus the child of a wealthy Manhattan investment banker. The person who grew up in poverty thinks about risk and reward in a visceral daily survival mode. They know what it means to be hungry. The banker's child literally cannot fathom that biological fear, even if they read 100 books on poverty and tried their absolute hardest to empathize.
Right, or think about the person who grew up in an era of hyperinflation where the actual paper money in your pocket is visibly losing purchasing power every single day, where you rush to buy groceries before the prices change at noon versus someone who grew up with perfectly stable prices.
Their baseline assumptions are entirely opposite.
Exactly. Their subconscious assumptions about whether it is safe to save money in a bank are totally different. The stockbroker who watched everything evaporate during the Great Depression experienced an emotional trauma that a young tech worker, basking in the glory of the late 1990s dot-com boom, simply cannot imagine.
There are even vast geographic differences. An Australian who hasn't seen a local severe economic recession in 30 years has a baseline optimism and an experience of the economy that almost no American of the exact same age possesses.
That's a great point.
We all go through life anchored to a very specific set of views about how money works. And those views vary wildly depending on exactly where and when we were dropped into the timeline of history.
To illustrate this, there is an amazing, highly revealing anecdote about John F. Kennedy. The year is 1960, and JFK is running for president of the United States. Now, the defining economic trauma of the previous generation was undeniably the Great Depression of the 1930s.
The shadow over the whole country.
Right. A reporter asks JFK what he actually remembered personally from the Depression, and JFK gave this incredibly blunt, almost shockingly honest answer.
He admitted he had absolutely zero firsthand knowledge of the suffering.
Zero. JFK said, and I'm summarizing his quote here, "My family had one of the great fortunes of the world, and it was actually worth more than ever during the Depression. We had bigger houses, we had more servants, we traveled more." The only direct visual exposure JFK had to the massive suffering of the Great Depression was watching his wealthy father hire some extra gardeners, essentially out of pity, just to give them a meager job so they could afford to eat. JFK openly admitted he didn't truly learn about the Great Depression until he read about it in an economics textbook at Harvard.
And just looking at this as a sociological data point, entirely removing any political judgment from the equation, historically, this was a massive vulnerability for JFK in the 1960 election against his primary opponent, Hubert Humphrey.
Oh, for sure.
The American public genuinely wondered how someone with absolutely no emotional, visceral understanding of the biggest economic trauma of their lives could be trusted to empathize with their financial struggles. It was a massive hurdle, and it was only overcome because JFK shared a different, equally powerful generational trauma with the voters: his combat service in World War II.
That is fascinating. The shared emotional nightmare of the war was able to bridge the massive gap of their unshared economic experience, and this perfectly highlights the limits of both empathy and academic study.
It really does.
You can study the Great Depression on a highly detailed spreadsheet. You can model the historic frequency of huge stock market declines. You can know the exact percentage of unemployment. But a spreadsheet cannot model the deep, gnawing fear of eviction. It cannot model the terror of not being able to feed your children.
There is a quote from the investor Michael Batnick here that perfectly encapsulates this entire idea. Some lessons have to be experienced before they can be understood. We are all, in a way, victims of our own narrow slice of reality.
Oh, wait, I really want to challenge this idea that we're completely hopelessly trapped by our lived experiences.
Okay, let's hear it.
Shouldn't reading history, or frankly, shouldn't listening to an in-depth deep dive like the one we're doing right now allow us to bypass that trap? I mean, isn't the entire point of human education to let us borrow someone else's emotional scars without having to suffer the wound ourselves?
In theory, yes.
Because it feels a bit like saying you can read the entire 1,000-page flight manual on how to fly a Boeing 747. You can memorize every single dial and switch in the simulator, but until you are actually sitting in the cockpit 30,000 feet in the air during intense, violent turbulence, you don't truly know how you'll react. Are we really that beholden to our own limited past?
That flight manual analogy is brilliant, and let's pull on that thread. Because reading the manual is essential. It gives you the technical what to do. But it doesn't stop your biological heart rate from spiking when the turbulence actually hits and the oxygen masks drop.
Right.
Your intellectual knowledge of aviation history evaporates in the face of personal immediate panic. The argument here is that while education is vital, it rarely overrides the primal emotional imprint of lived experience when we are under immense financial pressure. And we actually have hard empirical data to back up just how deeply we are anchored to our specific generational experiences.
Yes. Let's move from anecdotal stories like JFK to the hard data. How exactly does the random, uncontrollable year of your birth hardwire your financial brain? This brings us to a really fascinating study from 2006 by the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Two economists, Ulrike Malmendier and Stefan Nagel, dug through 50 years of data from the Survey of Consumer Finances. Now, in theory, pure economic rationality says that people should make investment decisions based on their current goals, their current age, and the investment options available to them today.
But that is not what they found at all, is it?
Not even close. They discovered that people's lifetime investment decisions are heavily, almost irrevocably anchored to the specific experiences those investors had during their early adulthood.
Wow.
Their willingness to bear financial risk didn't depend on their intelligence or their level of education or how financially sophisticated they were. It depended almost entirely on the dumb luck of when and where they happened to be born.
The dumb luck of birth. And I want to pause and ask why. Why early adulthood? Why doesn't a massive market crash at age 50 rewire our brains the same way a crash at age 20 does?
It comes down to how we form our baseline understanding of reality.
Mhm.
In your 20s, you are entering the workforce, you are earning your first real paychecks, and you are trying to figure out how the machine of the world operates. You are highly impressionable.
Right, you're a blank slate.
Exactly. If the world rewards your investments during that decade, your brain wires itself to believe the system is inherently safe and rewarding. If the world crushes your savings in your 20s, your brain wires itself for defense. By age 50, your baseline is already set. A crash is seen as an anomaly, not the default state of the universe.
That makes perfect sense. And we have a perfect real-world example of this. Bill Gross, famed bond manager, absolute legend in the fixed income space. In a 2019 interview, Gross openly admitted that his incredible, historic success was inextricably tied to being born at the exact right moment in history.
Talk about timing.
Seriously. His career perfectly coincided with a massive generational collapse in interest rates, which acts as a huge tailwind for bond prices.
And for anyone who isn't familiar with the mechanics, think of a bond like an IOU. You loan an entity money, and they promise to pay you a fixed interest rate over time. But if inflation suddenly skyrockets in the broader economy, that fixed payout you locked in becomes functionally worthless. It's a wealth incinerator.
Right.
However, if interest rates in the economy collapse, the high fixed rate you previously locked in suddenly becomes incredibly valuable. It's a gold mine.
So to Bill Gross, because of the era he lived through and managed money in, bonds were these beautiful, reliable, wealth-generating machines. But if you take his father's generation, who had to endure periods of crushing high inflation during their prime earning years, they viewed bonds entirely differently.
Oh, completely.
To them, locking your money up at a fixed rate while the cost of living exploded was financial suicide. They viewed bonds as wealth incinerators. It is the exact same financial instrument, viewed as either a miracle or a hazard, based purely on the year of your birth.
And we can visualize this data to see just how stark the differences are. Let's look at the stock market. I want you, listening to this right now, to imagine being born in the year 1950. During your teens and 20s, those crucial, impressionable years we just talked about, the stock market, adjusted for inflation, went literally nowhere. It was completely flat. You watched a decade of stagnation.
Yeah, contrast that with someone born just 20 years later, in 1970. During their teens and 20s, the S&P 500 increased almost tenfold, adjusted for inflation. Tenfold.
That's massive.
So you have two groups of incredibly smart, capable people, separated only by the random chance of a 20-year gap in their birth year, and they're going to go through the rest of their entire lives with completely different, deeply ingrained, fundamentally opposite views on whether the stock market is a safe place to put their hard-earned money.
And we see the exact same psychological phenomenon with inflation. If you were born in 1960s America, inflation during your teens and 20s sent prices up more than threefold. You vividly remember sitting in your car in massive gas lines.
The gas lines, yeah.
You remember the visceral, sickening feeling of your paycheck stretching noticeably less far every single month? Your brain is wired to constantly fear the erosion of your purchasing power.
But if you were born in 1990, inflation has been so historically low for your entire conscious life that, until very recently, it probably never even crossed your mind as a major life-altering risk.
Yeah.
Your brain simply wasn't wired to fear it. It wasn't part of your reality.
The data also highlights how disparate our realities can be, even in the exact same moment in time, based on demographics or geography. And taking all judgment off the table for a second, just looking at this purely as a measure of differing economic realities. In November 2009, the nationwide unemployment rate in America was generally reported as being around 10%.
Right, a rough blended average for the entire country.
But underneath that blended average, the reality was deeply fractured. For African-American males aged 16 to 19 without a high school diploma, the unemployment rate was a staggering 49%, almost half.
That is brutal.
Meanwhile, for Caucasian females over age 45 with a college degree, the unemployment rate in that exact same month was just 4%.
So you literally have a 49% reality living right next door to a 4% reality within the exact same economy. And historically, the contrasts are even more brutal. Look at World War II. Local stock markets in Germany and Japan were completely wiped out. Entire regions were bombed to rubble.
Just absolute devastation.
Our notes point out that at the end of the war, German farms could only produce enough food to provide citizens with 1,000 calories a day. It was absolute crushing devastation.
But across the ocean, in the United States, The stock market more than doubled from 1941 through the end of 1945, and the U.S. economy was the strongest it had been in almost 2 decades.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the ultimate point here is that no one should expect a survivor of 1945 Germany to respond to financial risk the exact same way as an American who thrived and saw their wealth double during that exact same year.
Of course not.
I keep thinking of this like a biological imprinting. You know how a baby bird hatches? It imprints on the very first large moving object it sees, and it just assumes, okay, that's my mother, that's my reality for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
It seems like our brains imprint on the economic conditions of our 20s in the exact same way. But this raises a massive question for the industry. If our willingness to bear risk is genuinely just the dumb luck of when and where we were born, doesn't that render traditional financial advice completely useless?
It certainly challenges it.
How can a financial advisor give blanket advice like the classic 60-40 portfolio, where you put 60% in stocks for growth and 40% in bonds for safety, if half their clients financially imprinted on a massive bull market and the other half imprinted on a devastating recession?
It completely changes the required skill set of the advisor.
Yeah.
A good financial advisor, according to this behavioral framework, isn't just a mathematician running Monte Carlo simulations. They must be a financial therapist.
A financial therapist. I like that.
They have to deeply understand the client's historical, generational imprint before they can ever hope to guide their behavior. You cannot give blanket 60-40 advice because you cannot assume different groups are influenced by the same incentives or that they will even trust the same sources of advice.
Right.
If a client's brain is wired by the trauma of 2008, telling them the math says they should be 80% in stocks is like speaking a foreign language.
Which means we have to radically adjust our judgment of other people's decisions. We've established that people have vastly different worldviews based on their birth and their specific background. Now, we need to apply this to decisions that look objectively wrong or even outrageous from the outside to see how they actually make perfect sense from the inside.
This is a crucial, deeply challenging pivot in our discussion.
Yeah.
Rationalizing the outrageous. We have 2 highly provocative examples to demonstrate how a unique mental model justifies decisions we might otherwise instantly condemn.
The first example centers on a story regarding Foxconn, the massive Taiwanese electronics manufacturer that makes many of the devices we literally use every single day.
We all have their products.
We all do. The New York Times did a massive expose on the working conditions at these factories, which are often described as grueling, monotonous, and atrocious. And readers in the West were, understandably, deeply upset by what they read about sweatshop labor.
And again, stepping entirely outside of our political or moral judgments for a moment, we are exploring this impartially to understand differing economic realities.
Yes, strictly impartially.
The research includes a profoundly challenging counter-perspective to illustrate how a different starting point changes everything. It comes from a comment written by the nephew of a Chinese Foxconn worker.
The nephew's response is jarring to a Western reader. He wrote that his aunt worked for several years in what Americans universally call a sweatshop. He acknowledged it was hard work, there were long hours, low wages, and poor conditions.
Right.
But then he revealed what his aunt actually did for survival before she got the factory job. She was a prostitute.
And in the nephew's own words, the idea of working in a factory compared to her previous lifestyle of survival was a massive, life-saving improvement.
What?
He wrote that his aunt would much rather be exploited by a capitalist boss for a few dollars a day than have her physical body exploited by several men for pennies. He expressed a deep frustration at Western judgment, pointing out the stark, brutal lack of alternative opportunities in her reality compared to an American reality.
It leaves you deeply conflicted. Part of you wants to argue fiercely against the factory conditions, and part of you wants to understand her reality. But primarily, it serves as an extreme, visceral example of how vastly different lived experiences can lead to totally opposite views on a topic that one side intuitively feels should be morally black and white.
Exactly.
To the aunt, the factory job was literal salvation. To the Western reader sitting in a comfortable home, it was exploitation. Both are using the information they have, plugging it into their unique mental models, and arriving at completely different yet internally logical conclusions.
Exactly. Every single financial or economic decision a person makes complete sense to them in the exact moment they make it. They are checking the boxes they need to check based on the story they tell themselves about how the world works and what options are actually available to them.
And that perfectly sets up the second example of rationalizing the outrageous, which is the biggest, most frustrating head-scratcher in all of personal finance. Lottery tickets.
Oh, the lottery.
So, the Foxconn story shows us how an environment of absolute poverty can make a grueling factory job look like salvation. But what happens when an environment removes the prospect of salvation altogether? How do people behave when there are no factory jobs, no pathways to wealth, and absolutely no hope? That brings us to the lottery.
The statistics on lottery tickets in the U.S. are absolutely staggering.
They really are. Americans spend more money on lottery tickets than they do on movies, video games, music, sporting events, and books combined.
And the critical defining demographic detail here is who's actually winning them. It is overwhelmingly the lowest income households.
Yeah.
The data states that the lowest income households in the U.S. spend an average of $412 a year on lotto tickets. That is 4 times the amount spent by those in the highest income groups.
And here is the bitter, heartbreaking irony of that math. 40% of Americans cannot easily come up with $400 in a sudden emergency, which means, mathematically, the exact same people who are spending $412 a year on lottery tickets are the very people who do not have a $400 safety net.
They're the same people.
They are literally blowing their emergency fund on a mathematically impossible 1 in a million chance.
From the outside, from the perspective of someone with a stable salary, a 401k, and health insurance, this looks objectively insane. It looks like a terrible, inexcusable mathematical error.
But I want to challenge us to step into the shoes of the lottery buyer and articulate their hidden logic. If you strain your empathy just a little bit, you can hear their deeply ingrained rationale.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we imagine their inner monologue, it goes something like this. We live paycheck to paycheck. Saving money seems literally, physically impossible. Our prospects for ever getting a much higher wage seem entirely out of reach. We can't afford nice vacations. We can't afford new cars, health insurance, or homes in safe neighborhoods. We cannot put our kids through college without taking on crippling generational debt.
The things that wealthier demographics simply take for granted as standard milestones of a successful American life are viewed by this group as absolute impossibilities.
Exactly, so the monologue continues. Buying a lottery ticket is the only time in our entire lives that we can hold a tangible, physical dream of getting the good stuff that you already have. We are paying for a dream. You don't understand that because you are already living the dream. That is why we buy more tickets than you do.
It entirely transforms the nature of the purchase. They aren't buying a mathematical probability of winning money. They are purchasing a momentary psychological escape from a crushing reality. They are literally buying hope.
I really wrestle with this concept because I can completely, deeply understand the empathy behind it. I understand why they do it. But at the same time, buying a lotto ticket when you are broke is still objectively, mathematically, a terrible idea that actively keeps you broke.
It is.
It's like drinking seawater when you are stranded on a raft in the middle of the ocean and dying of thirst. I understand the desperate impulse. It feels like relief in the very moment the water touches your throat, but it is actively, chemically accelerating your death.
Wow.
So I have to ask you, where is the line? Where is the line between having deep empathy for someone's unique, trauma-informed mental model and recognizing that the story they are telling themselves is actively destroying them?
I love that raft analogy, but let's look at it from the perspective of the person on the raft. If you are on that raft and you genuinely, deeply believe that no rescue boat is ever coming, that you are going to die out there, regardless of what you do, why not enjoy the temporary, fleeting relief of the seawater?
Yeah, I see.
That is the tragic, fatalistic math they are doing. Empathy doesn't mean endorsing the self-destructive behavior. No one is saying, therefore, buying lottery tickets is a sound financial strategy.
Right.
The point is that if you want to stop the person from drinking the seawater, screaming at them about the chemical composition of sodium chloride won't work. Yelling at them about compounding interest won't work. You have to understand why they are doing it. You have to convince them a rescue boat is actually possible before you can offer them fresh water in a way they will accept.
That is so powerful.
You have to realize that very few people make major financial decisions purely by consulting a spreadsheet. They make these decisions at the dinner table. They make them in a place where personal history, ego, pride, marketing, and deeply weird incentives are all scrambled together into a messy human narrative.
Which brings us to our final macro-level realization of this deep dive. Beyond our individual birth years, beyond our personal economic traumas, There is a massive, overarching reason why almost all of us struggle with money, and it is simply this. The entire modern financial system is a brand new invention.
Totally new.
We are not crazy, we are just absolute fumbling beginners.
This is a vital piece of historical context that we almost universally ignore. We assume that because money itself has existed for millennia, our relationship with managing it should be fully evolved. It is noted that King Alyattes of Lydia, in what is now modern-day Turkey, created the first official currency around 600 BC.
That's ancient.
So the concept of money, of exchange, is ancient.
But the concepts of modern saving, and particularly modern retirement investing, are practically infants. We have this deep-seated nostalgic myth of the good old days of retirement. We imagine our great-grandparents enjoying these long, leisurely, 30-year decades of pension-funded relaxation on the porch somewhere.
But the historical data completely shatters that illusion.
Absolutely. We look at the landscape today, where at the end of 2018, there was $27 trillion sitting in U.S. retirement accounts. It is the main driver of how the common person interacts with the global market. But the entire societal concept of being entitled to a retirement, of stopping work at 65 and living for another 2 decades is, at most, 2 generations old.
Before World War II, the expectation and the harsh physical reality was that most Americans simply worked until they died.
Until they died.
The labor force participation rate for men aged 65 and older was consistently above 50%, all the way until the 1940s. You didn't retire, you just kept working until your body gave out.
Social Security was created to change this harsh reality, but even that started incredibly small and took decades to mature. Think about Ida Mae Fuller, who cashed the very first Social Security check in 1940. It was for exactly $22.54.
Barely anything.
Even adjusted for inflation, that's only about $416 today. You cannot live a life of leisure on that. It wasn't until the 1980s that the average Social Security check for retirees exceeded $1,000 a month in inflation-adjusted terms.
And what about pensions? Because whenever we talk about financial struggles today, everyone always says, oh, well, back in the day, everyone had a great corporate pension that took care of them from cradle to grave.
Everyone says that.
Think about your own grandparents for a second. Did they actually have that mythical pension we always hear about?
Probably not.
That is perhaps the biggest myth of all. The data explicitly busts that narrative. In 1975, only a quarter, just 25% of those aged 65 or older, even had a pension income. And even among that lucky minority, the pension only made up 15% of their total household income.
Wow, 15%.
There is a deeply revealing quote from a 1955 New York Times article. Everyone talks about retirement, but apparently very few do anything about it.
So the idea that every middle-class worker deserves and can seamlessly achieve a dignified, multi-decade retirement where they live off their own self-directed market investments, that idea only really took hold in the 1980s.
Very recently.
When you list the birth dates of our modern financial pillars, the sudden, violent shift is astonishing. The 401k, the absolute backbone of American retirement savings, didn't even exist until 1978.
That's right.
The Roth IRA, which we are all told is essential for tax-free growth, was born in 1998. The author jokes that if the Roth IRA were a person, it would barely be old enough to legally drink.
Index funds, the tool that democratized investing for the masses, are less than 50 years old. Widespread consumer debt, the normalization of massive mortgages, revolving credit cards, and auto loans didn't truly explode until after World War II, when the GI Bill made borrowing accessible to millions of average citizens.
Even the college landscape has shifted at breakneck speed. The share of Americans over age 25 with a bachelor's degree went from less than 1 in 1940 to 1 in 4 by 2015.
A massive jump.
At the exact same time, the average tuition rose more than 4-fold, adjusted for inflation. The massive student loan crisis isn't happening because millions of 18-year-olds suddenly, simultaneously, became financially reckless. It's happening because society was hit with this massive systemic change in higher education costs so incredibly fast, and families have no decades of accumulated wisdom to draw from. We are literally winging it.
Think about this through the lens of evolution. Look at dogs. Dogs were domesticated roughly 10,000 years ago. And yet, after 10 millennia of living in our homes, they still retain some of the wild, instinctual behaviors of their wolf ancestors.
They still spin around in circles 3 times before they lie down on the living room carpet to trample the imaginary grass.
Exactly. 10,000 years of domestication, and the wild instincts remain hardwired. Yet humans have had maybe 20 to 50 years of total experience navigating the extreme complexities of the modern financial system.
It's nothing.
Navigating 401k allocations, index fund expense ratios, variable rate mortgages, and compound interest. And we somehow expect ourselves to be perfectly acclimated, perfectly rational, unemotional decision makers.
It's absurd when you put it that way. It's like we just handed the keys to a highly complex warp-speed spaceship to a teenager who just got their learner's permit, and society is shocked and outraged when they inevitably scratch the paint on the first turn.
It's a great analogy.
If our brains are biologically still wired like hunter-gatherers, scanning the horizon for immediate threats and immediate calories, but we are trying to navigate the long-term tax implications of a Roth IRA conversion, what hope do we actually have? Does this mean we should give ourselves and, more importantly, give others a massive break when we inevitably make financial mistakes?
I believe that is the most compassionate and accurate takeaway we can have. For a topic that is so heavily influenced by deep primal emotion rather than pure mathematical fact, our sheer newness to the game is a massive systemic problem. We don't always do what we're mathematically supposed to do with money because we are all universally relatively new to this game. No one is crazy. We're all just making decisions based on our own unique, incredibly recent experiences that seem to make sense to us in a given moment of stress.
This has been an incredible perspective-shifting journey. To bring it all together for you, listening right now, the psychology of money is clearly not about learning better math. You don't need a Princeton engineering degree to succeed.
Not at all.
It's about realizing that every single financial decision, whether it's made at a modest kitchen table over a stack of bills or in a towering corporate boardroom, is a complex, messy scramble of personal history, ego, pride, marketing, and the dumb, uncontrollable luck of when you were born. We are all making decisions that make sense to us in the moment.
And the practical application of this knowledge is profound. I highly encourage you to look at your own financial life.
Yes, absolutely.
Look at your investment portfolio, your lingering debt, your saving habits, your deeply held fears about the stock market, not with harsh punitive judgment, but with genuine curiosity.
I love that. Curiosity, not judgment.
Ask yourself, what tiny 0.000000001% sliver of world history has disproportionately shaped my views? What generational trauma or what historic economic boom time am I secretly anchoring all my financial decisions to?
It completely shifts your perspective on your own life. Which leads me to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you to mull over. We've talked about the janitor and the genius. We talked about the dumb luck of birth.
The big themes.
Right. If our financial behaviors, our core tolerance for risk, our ability to be patient, our deep-seated financial anxieties are primarily the products of the random year we were born and the unique emotional scars we happen to carry, then how much of our financial success is actually earned through our own hard work and intelligence?
That's the million-dollar question.
And how much of it is just sheer, unadulterated luck? It's something to really chew on the next time you look at your bank account. And just when you think you have a handle on it, there is a final, tantalizing tease in the material we reviewed today. Now, let me tell you a story about how Bill Gates got rich. But that is a massive, complicated story for you to discover on your own.
A perfect place to end. The landscape remains murky, but perhaps now, armed with a little more empathy and a little less judgment, it is easier to navigate.
Exactly. We stepped into this deep dive expecting the clean, crisp, objective X-ray of financial intelligence, only to realize the X-ray machine is broken. The diagnostic landscape of money isn't a hard science. It's a deeply human, beautifully flawed psychology. Until next time, keep exploring.